When Sega released Daytona USA to the arcades in 1993, they were arguably already the kings of the medium, with numerous classic arcade titles in their library such as Afterburner II, Outrun, and Golden Axe. In developing the Sega Model 2 arcade board in the early 90s, they sought to maintain that dominance throughout the decade, and Daytona USA was the first game released on this new platform. The game was stunning, offering a driving experience that was truly revolutionary when you compared it to the driving games of the 80s. Once you got on a Daytona cabinet, you never wanted to go back to Outrun, let alone pole position, despite their status as classics. In fact, Daytona captured a visceral sense of speed that even its modern competition of the time, Virtua Racing and Ridge Racer, could not muster. Daytona ran at 60 FPS, regardless of how many objects were on screen. It was smooth and colorful, and it controlled well enough to allow the player to linger on the razor's edge between control and collision. As a kid, getting onto one of these machines was a rarity. They were expensive, infrequently found, and often crowded. If one could get a game, the ecstasy of the experience was quickly erased by the insufficiency of funds, and in my case, at 12 years old, insufficient reflexes. Where I lived, moreover, you had to go out and seek these games out in the world. They were at bowling alleys, movie theaters, and seaside arcades that one would frequent only on special occasions. You could walk to the local convenience store or neighborhood pool and play Street Fighter II, but it was an event to play Daytona shortly after its release, and the same could be said for other Model 2 games such as Virtua Fighter 2. It was thus somewhat thrilling to hear that Sega was planning to release a home version of Daytona USA to its new Sega Saturn platform in 1995. I say somewhat because at the time, Sega had alienated much of its fan base by releasing underwhelming peripherals like the Sega CD and the 32X, and consumer confidence in the company was severely degraded from its welcome to the next level Genesis heyday. The Saturn was viewed within my circle of friends with a healthy bit of skepticism, such that only one person purchased it at launch. The hasty launch itself, a moment that has become part of the lore of video game history, did little to help the system. It forced developers to rush games out ahead of schedule and killed the company's standing within the retail chain, almost to the same extent that its ill-conceived 32X killed the market's confidence in Sega's ability to innovate. So when the magazines spoke of these Model 2 arcade games coming to the Saturn, many had a wait-and-see approach. I waited, I saw the game, and I even played it for a bit in a store and at the house of that sole friend who bought the Saturn, and I remember liking it. It was certainly one of the most graphically impressive console racing games that I had played up to that point, and I thought that it was a good showpiece for the console. It was not, however, anything close to the glory of the arcade cabinet, and it suffered from a horrendously short draw distance and graphics that, while clearly better than any 16-bit console racer, nonetheless looked blocky and choppy. And I believe it ran at 20 frames per second. It was the kind of game which you said was cool, but it was also one that seemed to support your decision at the time to wait for the PlayStation. In many ways, this was a shame, because had Sega released, say, Virtua Fighter 2, one of the finest arcade-to-home ports of all time, to the Saturn before Daytona USA, it might have done more to sell the system. By January 1996, when Virtua Fighter 2 was finally released, the PlayStation had already been on the market for about 3 months, and for many, the battle was already over. For me personally, I never really overcame this prejudice when collecting for the Saturn. I got my copy of Daytona USA shipped to me for free along with my Japanese Saturn, and I spent about 4 minutes with it before eagerly swapping it out for other Japanese titles that I was excited to play: Snatcher, Fire Pro Wrestling 6-Man Scramble, and Panzer Dragoon. This was in March 2011, a date which I remember vividly because my Japanese Saturn was postmarked on the morning of the deadly Sendai earthquake and tsunami that crippled Japan for the next few months. Over the following 3 years, the game just sat in my closet, untouched, and collecting a layer of dust so thick that it actually became a marker of my prejudice and neglect for the game. I was thus surprised when, over this year's Martin Luther King holiday weekend, I found myself going back to the game. I fired up the Saturn, and to my surprise, I really enjoyed it. This was all the more improbable because between my initial time with the game in 1995 and my brief 4 minutes in 2011 when I had just gotten the system, I had played it often on the Dreamcast and thought that the Dreamcast version was the definitive home conversion of Daytona, that it was really the experience in its purest form. And in many ways it still is. That game, the Dreamcast version, runs at 60 frames per second. It has more tracks, more cars from which to choose, and sports those gloriously clean, clear, and bright graphics for which Sega's Naomi platform was famous. The Saturn version simply looks hideous in comparison to this. It chugs along at what seems like a glacial pace compared to its Dreamcast brother, and even compared to modern games, of course. And yet playing through the arcade and Saturn modes, the latter of which does not saddle you with the classic checkpoint-to-checkpoint time limit that is the hallmark of all Sega arcade racing games, I found the Saturn version to be quite playable and, to my surprise, deeply enjoyable. In fact, after about an hour or so, I actually came to the conclusion that it controlled better than its flashier Dreamcast counterpart. It is a simple game, to be sure, but the combination of the good controls, cheesy yet catchy soundtrack, and severe challenge on higher difficulty settings makes it a rather hypnotizing, if not addicting, experience. Buried in the solid gameplay, however, was a deeper nostalgia for the title that I did not know that I had. I was playing it not only for what it was, but also for what it likely represented at the time. Or, to be self-critical, what I believe I would have seen it to represent had I played it for longer back in 1995. It is coming up on 20 years since the game first hit the store shelves, and it seems to me that 1995 and the release of Daytona USA is as good of a historical marker as any for the time when the gaming industry's long-used advertising slogan, the arcade experience at home, started to become true. Yes, there were games released prior to Daytona USA that did a great job of capturing the arcade experience. Super Street Fighter II for the 3DO comes to mind. But Daytona USA for the Saturn really did have a unique feel to it. It was a next-gen arcade game running on a next-gen home console, and doing so respectably for the time. It approximated its source material more capably than even the best 16-bit conversions did of their coin-op source material. And of course, I'm going to exclude Neo Geo AES here for obvious reasons. But as I sat in front of my old CRT playing this game, I remember those prized moments at the big movie theater or arcade boardwalk, and felt that, from a 1995 perspective, this game is really not that far off from capturing the feel of those times on the arcade cabinet. It didn't have mind-blowing graphics that I thought the future of gaming would bring, but it did a good job of providing an experience that prior to 1995 was all but impossible. As I played through those iconic stages again and again, I remember the feel of the original game, and kind of glancing at the edges of my CRT monitor, expected to see the dim neon lights of the movie theater, and to hear the din of the boardwalk arcade, or smell the fried chicken of the bowling alley, which was the closest location to me that offered Daytona back in the day. The fact that this experience could occur within the home, with very few compromises, again, from a 1995 perspective, was quite significant. Daytona USA for the Saturn was one of, I think, the first games to shift the location of gaming. It brought an experience that could only be fully enjoyed outside of the home into the comfort of the bedroom or the family room. It offered players a chance to practice the game and understand its intricacies and shortcomings without spending tons of money or being hassled by the bigger kids who wanted to go on the machine. In the arcades, one forgets that for all the nostalgia surrounding arcades, they were often unpleasant places. Sure, they were sources of blissful amusement, but they were also places in which the consumption of amusement was unpleasantly limited by financial and social constraints. Being able to have a convincing facsimile of a game that was previously in the exclusive domain of the arcade was a masterful innovation, and one that, I think by 1997, began to drive arcades out of business in the United States. Daytona USA may look like the polygonal equivalent of a Jackson Pollock painting set in motion, but if you take the time to play it with a certain historical imagination and enjoy its solid controls, you'll discover a true gem in the Saturn library. Not quite a hidden gem, but one whose luster was quickly enveloped by the glow of progress before it could be properly appreciated.